Hello.
Hello.
How's it going?
It's all right. Hanging in there.
That's good. One should always hang in places. Uh, Probably also join in my computer here so I could see whatever chat. Hopefully, no feedback. Doesn't look like. Nice.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I woke up earlier than I normally do, so I'm a little off. But yeah.
How's it going, everyone?
Hi,
Good. How are
Martin.
you?
Hi.
Looks like there's no meeting notes from last week. Did we just not have a meeting or something?
Did we cancel last week? I don't remember.
Yeah, last week, I think you and Rita were busy because of the timings. Alex was also busy. We joined at 9 o'clock, and then the timing was at 10 o'clock, so we joined back at 10 o'clock. But people had conflicts over from 10 to 11, so we ended up canceling it.
Oh, because of the
Gotcha.
time shift. Yeah.
So we officially 10 a.m. now?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, I think we
Nice.
still need to update the meeting notes. It says 9 a.m. So that's 10 a.m. Okay, looks like Xander's.
Apparently, there might also be a Google Calendar invite that I'm not aware of that I'm not sure who manages that.
I think that one is ancient. I don't know if it's still a thing.
It looks like I have the option to save it. 10 to 11. Let's see. I click save. Oh no, that's just wait, maybe.
Oh, looks like this is just a template.
All right. Well, I've set the calendar for 10 for myself at least. It's a template, you say. What does this say? Huh. Yeah, no, that didn't let me change it. Interesting to know it's not shared. Yeah, I'll have to figure out how to edit the invite. Was there anything else we want to talk about? The agenda's empty. I just put in a 24.
I had a few things a few questions I wanted to ask.
Yeah, did you want to ask them, and then if other people had stuff they wanted to talk about, we can add it to they can add it to the doc while we're talking.
Okay, sure. So one of my first questions had to do with the audit deployments replica. I was wondering if, for the sake of like high availability, if I could run it as a replica of 3. Or does it have to be only one like audit replica, with when you're running Gatekeeper as a whole?
It should be a singleton because of the way that audit results are reported. Like, the status field of the constraint gets updated with a certain amount of audit results up to a cap, and that's not done in a way where different pods can write and they won't conflict, right? So you'll get audit results that are kind of like mixed across pods, which isn't necessarily bad because there's like time skew anyway. Another impact, if you have like 3 live audit pods running at the same time, would be just extra load on the API server, right? Because they're all going to scrape the API server at the same time. Status is an interesting one because the audit pod also runs status and maybe a couple of other sub operations that I'm forgetting. Again, same kind of issue. You'll just get like a race condition. So you could get write conflicts. Probably won't break things, but yeah, you will see errors. There have been questions about could we use leader election for audit, kind of getting into the high availability bit. And the thing I wonder about for that is, so audit is not in the serving path of anything, right?
Yeah.
That audit pod. So uh, if it goes down, there's no like downtime impact, right? So it's more of a controller than a webhook. And controllers are usually eventually consistent anyway, right? So kind of the high availability model for audit currently would be if an audit pod dies, there's the audit deployment that will restart and recreate the audit pod. So the mere fact of failure doesn't mean there's no self-healing.
True.
And yeah, so if it's not latency sensitive, maybe you could just let Kubernetes fix that for you. Kind of the argument for leader election would be, okay, yeah, but if you had leader election, you could have audit running as like another audit pod running as a hot standby, right?
Yeah.
Which may save you some bootstrapping. Question would be, would the extra complexity and the extra cost of running those machines be worth it?
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, so one thing we recommended in the past for what Max was saying about the conflicting status field is to run with violation 0, and then either consume from PubSub or consume violations from the logs.
Yeah, that the status operation itself, you'll still get conflicting writes with that. Because there's there's that status controller, right, that reads all the bipod status objects and aggregates them into the actual status field of the resource. You could run the like you can rejigger how the processes are organized such that audit is running in a separate pod from status, and status is still running as a singleton. If you wanted to do that, there's nothing stopping you, but that's just something to be aware of there.
Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. And then my second question is relating more towards like the constraint templates. I have a specific Rego that I use consistently throughout, multiple policies for Gatekeeper. And I was just trying to figure out, hey, is there a way to, if I know I'm going to be using this specific template, is there a way for me to include it, maybe, I don't know, a part of the Gatekeeper deployment, or I don't know, I'm just, throwing stuff against the wall at this point. But the idea is that way I'm not having to reach out and, continue to copy and paste it as a library within my constraint template.
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts on that. So I'm just trying to get a link just to make sure you know. It sounds like you know because you say copy and paste as a library, but because there actually is like a libs field in
Uh-huh.
the Rego source for a constraint template.
Yep.
Okay. So you're familiar with that. Uh, there's a bit of an issue with trying to use shared codes, shared Rego code across constraint templates. Actually, a couple of issues now. The first, I would kind of liken it to using the library in the constraint template. That field is kind of like static compiling of dependencies as opposed to dynamic loading of libraries. Um, and the trade-offs are kind of similar, right? In the sense that if you have static dependencies, you no longer need to worry about the dynamic dependency being in the root system, right? And you don't
Yeah.
need to worry about version conflicts across the various consumers of that static dependency. The downside obviously is like you use extra space, you're kind of repeating yourself. Hopefully there's not much of a human cost because like part of the goal of the libs thing is to make it so that you could develop a pipeline that compiles those in for you so you're not stuck like manually copying and pasting because
Yeah.
that truly would suck. Um, in terms of specific concerns with dynamic libraries, um, there's a couple of places where it gets dicey from either a Kubernetes perspective or a performance perspective or a dependency perspective, right? The dependency perspective is just that version conflict, right? Like if you have 5 constraint templates sharing the same core dependency and one needs to be updated, it's going to be very hard to juggle that, right?
Yeah.
There's kind of ways around it if you're careful with how you write your library and your order of operations for updating. You're very careful about making sure the eventual consistency goes through, right? That all pods have ingested the new library. Then you update your templates or constraints, make sure that they're all updated, then do whatever further updates, blah, blah, blah. But that's a very much more weighty process than just running kubectl apply.
Mhm.
So that's the first bit. And then that's not even getting into dependency hell, right? Where there's just unresolvable conflicts. Like you can't run everything at the same time.
Yeah.
Kubernetes wise, with eventual consistency, there's an issue. Like say you had your library and you had your templates and everything, and it was all in the same manifest, and you kubectl applied it. There will be some delay between that apply and when it actually gets read by whichever pods, right? Before the pods receive the watch event from the K8s API server.
Mhm.
So there's no guarantee that that dependency will exist. This isn't necessarily an insurmountable issue, right? You kind of get into like, what's your preferred failure mode there, right? Do you want to fail open, fail closed? Validating admission policy kind of has this, I think, right? If you think about if you have a policy binding, but the policy definition hasn't yet been applied or something like that, right? So it's not that this problem hasn't been faced and addressed in Kubernetes before, but it does add some complexity. The last bit, and probably the most salient bit, would be code isolation and performance with Rego. So one thing that we did, wow, it might be 2 years ago now, with Rego is every constraint template runs in its own Rego environment. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is just straight up performance, right? Prior to us making that change, what we did was we compiled every constraint template into its own, or into the same Rego environment, right? So it's basically it all combined into one giant blob of Rego source code. But that led to like n squared complexity for ingesting each marginal constraint template, right? Because you're not just compiling that new constraint template, you're recompiling every other constraint template that's been added prior.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So because the Rego environment isn't shared, like shared libraries aren't really a thing. You could kind of fake it maybe by copying the libraries everywhere you're instantiating Rego, but then it's just as inefficient from a complexity perspective as if the library were baked into a template. Maybe slightly less so because it's not in the template itself, but there's still copy pasting going on from a memory usage perspective. The other benefits are like when we had the shared Rego environment, we still tried to do isolation, right? We statically analyzed the Rego code. We limited certain things that could be expressed so that the source code of one template couldn't affect the source code of a different template. But running in separate Rego environments, you get a bit stronger of a sandboxing guarantee. Which helps if you have templates from different sources. And the last performance bit is Rego tries to index queries, index their source code, right? So that they can quickly know, hey, this execution path it isn't going to match. So I'm not going to evaluate that logical branch, and I'm just going to move on. And that's one way they maintain performance, their performance goals. And part of how we were able to do that sandboxing, this is not something that I validated, but I strongly suspect this is true because we did a lot of like with statements here. It likely interfered with that indexing. Whereas because now each Rego environment is separate, we can be a lot more simple with how we process the Rego internally. And so hopefully more of those performance optimizations, we can reap those, but still have the sandboxing. Sorry, that's a very long explanation, but hopefully it gives some context.
Yeah, yeah. I was I was trying to figure out if there was just I don't know, some sort of simpler way, but yeah, you maybe using like a pipeline where I'm not necessarily adding it myself, but it gets added to the end within the libs section of kind of template would be fine.
Yeah, like that's I'm curious if we ever hit a point where that's not tenable because the libraries get like too large.
Yeah.
But until then, it seems like there's less user risk with the copying.
Okay. Yeah, because I haven't run into a instance where, my files were too big. Nothing like that.
Yeah. Yeah, do let us know though. If you do, I'd be very curious.
Yeah. Thank you. That's all I have.
Oh, thank you. Did anyone have anything that they added to the agenda? Nope. Is there anything anyone wanted to talk about? I did add some comments to the enforcement action doc. Is just reiterating, I think this is largely a solved problem. I just Kate has already looked at the going from one field to many field. This is like kind of, there's some extra complexity because we're also going from string to non-trivial like JSON object, though I think that's analogous to adding a field. So I just wanted to say like, no, seriously, like the answer is in that standards doc, I think. I just wanted us to make sure that that was the case and make sure we integrated those standards into our design rather than you needed to answer my specific questions as long as they were like already covered by those standards, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I looked at that doc and your questions really make sense, right? Uh, the one follow-up question I have about the comment uh, that you left, I think today. So the one thing that I understood from that document was to, so if when we are moving to this kind of things where we are building a list of things from singular list, right? The one thing that they provide a guidance on is to populate the first entry of that field with the singular value, which really makes sense because that's how you can construct the original value back as well, right? But while in doing so, right, in our case, if enforcement action is set to deny and we populate the first entry of that list to deny, enforcement point has to be everywhere, like so deny everywhere. And that makes sense. But now when user adds another entry to that list, let's say a subsequent entry saying action warned for enforcement point webhook, like what to make of that newly constructed list with two entries, right? Like now what happens?
Yeah, and sorry, I did this really quickly today so that I would have something to give you. So I apologize for not having a lot of depth here, but I glanced through the standards doc again, and it's kind of the principles I gleaned from how they were writing about their solution was that they were mostly concerned with old clients being able to continue to act reasonably on the system. I think that there's, with regard to compatibility, they're not trying to place us in like a straitjacket, right? Like you could kind of imagine anytime you add a field, um, the reason for adding a field is that you can like, there's now further customization you could do to the behavior of the system, right? Like whether that's, let's say you add a new field in that says on error reject versus on error allow, right? Like a failure policy, right? And previously it was always on error reject. You're adding this new capability that like, hey, now someone can allow instead because they'd like to fail open. Even with that like fairly simple common operation, right? You're just adding a new field to the object. You do wind up with this lack of forwards compatibility in the sense of if you take the state of the world in the new system where someone takes advantage of your new field and you try to roll it back, right? And so you've added that field in K8s 2, and you're going back to K8s 1. Like that field is not going to be interpreted, right? So you lose that functionality, and that's just kind of inevitable. And it seems like K8s is fine with that reality. And so it's more just making sure we understand the trade-offs around that reality. Like I think they have some principles around not wanting to lose state, but being fine losing functionality if you happen to be on that older client. And also making sure that they choose defaults such as that older clients that are writing to newer clusters, the behavior that was true in the old cluster with a certain config remains true in the new cluster, even if you aren't aware of those old fields. So they've definitely addressed those questions in the standards in terms of making a singular field plural. And they've definitely addressed those questions with regard to like straight up adding new fields, right? Kind of what's unique with us is we're doing both in one. So that might be a question mark. It might not be. Again, I'm sorry, I didn't like think deeply about this. Just in the past 30 minutes or so. So that, to my mind, would be the question where we can't just purely mechanically follow that guidance, right? Where we need to put some of our own thought in. Other than that, we just need to, as part of writing that design, just make sure we're referring to that guidance and justifying our design against it, and that's sufficient, right? The other thing that occurred to me while I was reading it, as you were pointing out, was this whole notion of you should like set certain things, right, depending on the state of the request. The most disturbing one to me with regard to implementation is, what did they say? If the plural field is emptied and the singular field is unchanged, then you should interpret that as, oh, this is an older client. It doesn't know about the plural field. It accidentally wiped it. You should just take the state of the plural field from the old object and put it to the new object. I think the only way to do that currently in non-core K8s is to use a mutation webhook, which I'm not like super thrilled about.
I, I think in that guide, what they're talking about is having implementing the API logic rather than modifying the objects itself. Like the backend interpretation of how that should be, rather than actually modifying YAML. I think
Unfortunately, though, we don't have access to the backend interpretation, right? So, and we would need it. So, like, for example, let's pretend that we did nothing, right? The API server, the K8s API server isn't aware that we're making a singular field plural, right? So if it sees a plural field being emptied in our resources, it's just gonna be like, okay, well, I guess this plural field should be empty now, and it's gonna delete it, which would normally be fine, right? And what's gonna happen is Gatekeeper is gonna receive a watch event, right? And we're going to update our cache. Now, we could say, well, as part of a controller, we're gonna, for every watch event, we're going to, this actually won't work, and I'll get to why in a second, just to preface, but we could say, we'll write a controller, and every time a constraint changes, we're gonna actually have this separate cache that is the state that things should be. and we're going to update things. And there's two problems with that. The first problem is, okay, but what happens if this is a fresh pod, right, that has no pre-existing state to compare to, right? It's just going to load it from the API server, and as far as it knows, the plural field was never populated. The other problem with it is that controllers are not actually guaranteed to see every intermediate state of an object, right? The way controller work queues work, when you receive an event, those events get deduplicated. So if I update a resource 10 times in a second, right, and my controller receives 10 watch events, but whatever, it was slow. So it doesn't process any of them until second two. It's only going to see one watch event, and it's going to retrieve the state of the object after all of those updates. It's not going to retrieve any of the intermediate state. So you just wouldn't have enough visibility to do something like that. So it winds up, you need to, I think, as far as I could tell, logic like that needs to be done at request time, which if you're not the API server,
Yeah.
kind of means you're stuck with mutation because that's the only way you can modify an object, which I don't know what the implications of that are necessarily. Like maybe it's fine. It does mean then that Gatekeeper's mutation webhook takes on a level of importance that it hasn't to date. Like right now, unless you're using mutation, you could just not install that webhook. And that's cool. Less so now, but only for specific Gatekeeper resources. Maybe the answer is to have a second mutation webhook specifically for Gatekeeper resources, but then you get into this whole latency thing. Yeah, it's that will be an implementation conundrum. And one of the best use cases for a mutation webhook that I've seen, to be clear.
I actually had another alternative in mind as well for.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing. You're kind of like dropping out audio.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me clearly now? Let me.
Yeah.
Okay. So, while I was thinking through this design, I realized that one option that we didn't consider was just to add enforcement point field separately rather than modifying it to a complex structure. Uh, if that makes things easier, maybe I can elaborate on that design and can actually re look at the whole design again to see if we missed anything, or we want to continue down on this path to figure out now how to implement this system using what you just described.
I don't think it helps either way. Because one, if we want action to be plural, which maybe we do if like we want to add pub sub or anything like that, then then we're pluralizing a field, and that's where just the mere act of pluralizing a field is what invokes all of these other considerations. The ends with enforcement points. I think action and enforcement point are kind of like inextricably linked, right? In the sense that, well, okay, let's just take one user request that we're trying to satisfy here. Someone wanted to, I'm probably going to get this backwards, but it's like kind of the same either way. They wanted to disable a constraint for the webhook,
Yep.
but enable it for audit,
Yep.
right? And so I guess that particular use case, you could argue if the you don't need to have a separate action if you're just like straight up matching whether the constraint is enforced or not against the enforcement point. Like that's fair. Yeah, so maybe it's worth knocking around. I don't think I can like off the top of my head lay out all of the
Okay.
trade-offs.
Maybe maybe I can list out an alternate thought that I was having on the same doc, and then you can take a look and we can discuss on that one.
Yeah, what one thing I would do is just compare your whatever thought you have against the alternatives that were already considered. Because we did have some discussion around this
Yeah, yeah,
periodically throughout the past like half year or so. So we should probably like, make sure we're not repeating ourselves.
yeah, yeah. So I was just thinking about adding the enforcement points array and keeping one enforcement action per constraint as opposed to the current design, which proposes multiple enforcement action and enforcement points per constraint. Uh,
Yeah.
that does mean that user kind of have more load on managing particular constraint for different enforcement points and relating to the same resources uh, as opposed to having everything in one constraint. Well, but I think it's relatively simpler design, or it could be relatively simpler design.
Yeah. Another another question that's kind of like going through my head right now is one interesting feature of validating admission policy that we cannot currently take advantage of is the fact that uh, the policy definition is separate from the bindings, if I remember right, and so I, I think this is possible. I would need to like double check the resource semantics, but you could have multiple policy definitions all glomming onto the same parameter object. That you definitely could do. Maybe the same binding object. I'm less certain about that because I think the binding might refer to the definition. But what's interesting about that is you get another layer of abstraction, right? So let's take the pretty common requirement that's actually pretty hard of I don't want external network connectivity on this cluster, right? And if you're running just raw K8s, there's certain resources that you want to look at, right? You don't want any load balancer services. Maybe you want certain network policies. There's a couple of other ways to egress data. But then if you install something like Istio or any of these other service meshes, the surface of ways to configure your network such that you can have external connectivity increases, right? So you actually cannot have a constraint that is as abstract as no external connections because you don't know the full state of the system, just a priori. On the other hand, if you can install constraint X augment a code that augments that constraint, right? Say everyone agrees on the shape of what a constraint for no external data looks like. And then, when you install Istio, right? Istio looks and injects their own policy definition that looks at that constraint and makes sure that Istio isn't doing any external data callouts. that could be a very powerful abstraction. But constraints don't have that level of granularity, right? Because the the code and the schema for the constraint are bundled into the constraint template. Sorry, that is a very long-winded way of me saying what you said about it kind of like changing how people would normalize their policies, right? Like instead you would have multiple constraints with different enforcement point selectors, and that's how you would do different actions per enforcement point. That's how I interpreted what you were saying. Also suggests to me that maybe there's a normalization problem here with regard to VAP and some other stuff. And now that people are a little bit more willing to have more complex configuration surfaces for policy, because back when Gatekeeper was first written, constraint template plus constraint, people are like, that's way too complex. I think that's less, that's a less prevalent sentiment now. Maybe there's something we could do about like re-architecting some of how this works. Anyway, does that, I don't know if that do the ideas around that make sense? If not, it's not an action plan for what we would do about that. But anyone
Yeah,
have any thoughts on it?
I didn't completely follow your chain of thoughts, but I did understand what you were trying to say on a high level, saying that, I mean, maybe we can come up with a design that revamps the constraint template and constraint thing.
Yeah, like if we wanted to maybe defer this work because we now know that there's some more fundamental stuff we want to do, right? That could inform our decision. Or if we realize, hey, there's what we're doing now, we kind of expect constraints and templates to be denormalized already, and maybe we're going to build another layer on top of that that like then bakes out those resources. That could be a way of doing what you're saying without incurring the UX penalty of now users need to repeat themselves. And that could also be a migration path to handle some of these unhandled use cases. It just strikes me that if it's hard, if we're hitting some barriers around how these primitives fit together, this is a good opportunity to kind of alter our approach if it makes sense to alter our approach.
But providing this granularity wouldn't mean that user have to repeat themselves at certain degrees anyways, right?
Which granularity?
The ability to control what per constraint action and enforcement point could be, like that in a sense means that user have to somehow take up the load of managing that anyways, right?
So I think there were some situations where users needed to have multiple constraints with this design. It's been long enough with the design as we're currently thinking about it, right? With the multiple enforcement actions targeted at multiple enforcement points. I
So for
forget what those use cases were.
yeah, so
Sorry, go ahead.
for current design, if you wanted to disable audit for a particular namespace, you'd have to have multiple constraints, as in you would just run webhook and getter everywhere, then run audit everywhere except for such particular namespace where you don't want it to run. And that together means that audit is excluded from that namespace, right? So that was also one of the user asks where they wanted to disable audit for a particular namespace.
Yeah.
So like,
Is it good?
yeah, so that's what I would argue, right? Like if we are providing this degree of control, what per constraint processes can do, then that means that there is an inherent added load for user to understand that and manage that itself, right?
Yeah. So yeah, we're already making a trade-off with the current design. There's some question around maybe number of users affected by that trade-off. And I'm not taking a position one way or another. I'm just talking about how I would like weigh these. And so then the question would be, would this idea of only one enforcement action, would that meaningfully affect the number of users affected? Uh, that that could be one way to compare the two. It also leads to like a design smell of maybe there's future optimization work we could do to allow this stuff to be a bit more denormalized. Uh, the thing about the namespace stuff for me was the match criteria currently are pluggable, right? And so if we make them non-pluggable, like if we integrate them into if we make them like a first party concept of the constraint framework itself, right, then the whole system becomes less agnostic. Um,
I,
on the oh good.
I think we swayed away. I was not suggesting moving edge criteria under constraint spec. Anyways,
With your current suggestion,
yeah,
you're saying yeah. You were saying only one enforcement action. Yeah, I'm with you there. I'm just trying to like load in the state of all the previous arguments that have been had to try to synthesize all the information. Because there's a lot of state that we're trying to deal with here. And I do sense something directionally that we may want to do, but I'm not 100% sure what it is yet, that would address this problem of users needing to repeat themselves. And whether that's like a pre-processing layer or if that's altering the API such that, you know, we can do the deduplication, obviously in a backwards compatible manner. Like this would be, there's ways of doing this. Altering the API such that things project more cleanly. I'm not sure. And knowing what our options are there might be helpful for weighing what you're talking about. Sorry, I know that's all very vague.
maybe we can sync up in a separate call, set something up, and then discuss ideas. That might be helpful to move along the design as well.
Yeah. For me, I think what I'm taking away is there's something that's at stake here. And I need to define what that is to know how I value the trade-offs and like how careful to be here, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, let's do a breakout session at some point.
Yep. Cool.
Sorry for taking all the oxygen. Are there any other topics that anyone added? Nope. Anyone else have thoughts on this? I know it was mostly me and Jada talking.
Nothing on my side.
Was that?
Nothing on my side.
Oh. Shall we call it 8 minutes early?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Sure.
Cool. It's good to see
Thank you.
everyone.
Yep. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Take care.